So, welcome back to the second video on Chapter 2 of the Planting of the English Americas. So, we left off after going over the Virginia colony, and now we're going to start with Maryland. So, Maryland was founded in 1634 by Lord Baltimore, and it was the second plantation colony and the fourth overall colony. And it was founded as a safe haven for Catholics because, as I explained in the earlier video, England had become Protestant, and Protestants and Catholics didn't get along, so Catholics were persecuted in England. And so Lord Baltimore created Maryland as a safe haven for all the Catholics in England to come to and thrive. And so Maryland was basically a tobacco colony like Virginia, and a lot of Maryland's land was given out by Lord Baltimore to other Catholics because the poor people who settled there were Protestant, while the Catholics gained all the wealth because of why it was founded. And so Maryland had a great deal of indentured servants, and because indentured servants were needed to work the tobacco plantations, they had a lot of labor coming in from England until around until later in the 1600s, black slavery became popular. And some important things to know about Maryland is the Acts of Toleration, which was created in 1649. And it was a document that granted religious toleration to all Christians. Now, despite the name, it wasn't that tolerant. So Jews and atheists were put to death because they didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. And so, basically, although it claimed to be tolerant, they weren't really. If you were Christian, you were accepted in Maryland, but it was mainly made as a Catholic safe haven. And so next I'm going to go, and so actually here's a map, and you can see here, this is Virginia, and it shows where it was settled from 1650 to 1700s, and you can see that as time goes on, it branches out, and that's because they needed a lot more land for the tobacco, and this is the Chesapeake Bay, and so these are called the Chesapeake Bay colonies. And so Maryland's over here, and Virginia's down here. And as they grew more and more tobacco, they needed to branch out more and more. And so you can see that as time went on, they needed to expand their land. And so another important thing is the West Indies. And although it wasn't a colony, one of the original 13 colonies, the British did settle in the West Indies. And they had secured claims to many different islands that the Spanish had been through, but islands like Jamaica in 1655. And on these islands, mostly sugar was grown, and these sugar plantations were extremely brutal. Thousands and thousands of slaves were used to operate these plantations because they tried to use the natives, but the natives died off because of disease, and they didn't really know the crop, while African slaves were more resistant to diseases because they had already been introduced to the Europeans, and they knew the crop better. So what's important to know here is to control these slaves, codes were created, slave codes, and these slave codes were brought over to the Americas, and they defined the legal status of the slaves and the rights of the masters, and these laws were extremely brutal, and they would later come into the Carolinas and shape American slavery, and so that's what's important to remember there. So the next colony we go over is the Carolinas. So in England, Charles I had been beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell was ruling, and so then Englishmen restored Charles II to the throne in the Restoration, and that's not as important to know, but what's important here is that Charles II, after he was put back into power, Carolina was created and named after him in 1670. And so Carolina was faced with violent confrontations with Spain and the Indians because they were one of the most southernmost colonies, and but they faced they were very resilient, and no matter what they faced, they flourished. And because of how far south they were, they had close ties with the Indies because they had the port of Charleston. And so many of these slave codes that I mentioned earlier were brought into the Carolinas. And in Carolina, the principal crop that they grew instead of sugar, like in the West Indies, was rice. And like I said earlier, the African slaves were more resistant to malaria and more familiar with rice and other crops, so they were more favored down there. Now, so the emergence of North Carolina is the next section, and many newcomers to Carolinas were squatters from Virginia. And what a squatter was a person without any land. And so they would just come down into Virginia and start setting up land for tobacco farming. And so two different kind of Carolinians emerged: the anti-authority, independent, small tobacco farmers in the north that had come down from Virginia, and the aristocratic, wealthier in the south, near the port of Charleston. And then there were rice and indigo farmers farther south, while the north was mostly tobacco. So in 1712, Carolina had separated into North and South Carolina, and it was mostly along the divide of these two different groups. And then also before that, in 1711, there was the Tuscarora Indian attacks on North Carolina, and they were crushed, and those Native Americans were either sold into slavery or fled to the north. And the ones that fled to the north became the Six Nation of the Iroquois, and that's the only thing you have to know about that. But what's important here is in 1712, Carolina separated into North and South Carolina along those two different groups. And so the last colony was Georgia, founded in 1733. And it was created by a high-minded group of philanthropists. But the main one to remember here for a test or for anything for the AP is James Oglethorpe. And he created it as a second chance for debtors and criminals. And the colony was named after King George II. But it was intended, the Crown intended Georgia to serve as a buffer between the British colonies and hostile Spanish Florida, and French Louisiana, who was also hostile towards the British. And so they were the southernmost colony, and they were sort of a buffer in between the southern plantation colonies and all the hostile raids that were being led by the Spanish and the French and the Native Americans. And so Georgia was mostly for Christians, except for Catholics. And they tolerated many missionaries, and they thrived really because it was a colony of debtors, and missionaries love debtors and sinners. And so many different missionaries went to Georgia, and John Wesley, who was one of these missionaries, later returned to England and founded Methodism. And because Georgia was the buffer colony, it was obviously slower to grow because it had to deal with all the hostile forces from the south. And so here you can see here Georgia was founded right below South Carolina and North Carolina, and it served as a buffer from Spain down here and Louisiana, which was off in this direction. And it basically protected Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina and Maryland. So an overview of the plantation colonies. Slavery was found in all the plantation colonies. These were Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And in the South, the cash crops were tobacco, rice, and some indigo. So the tobacco colonies were Virginia and Maryland, while in North Carolina, while in South Carolina and Georgia it was mostly rice and indigo. These plantation colonies are known for permitting some religious toleration, especially Maryland, while others in the north didn't, which I'll get to in the next chapter. But city growth in these southern plantation colonies was often stunted by forests, and everyone was spread out, so it was difficult to establish schools and churches. And often these plantation owners clashed with the Native Americans because they were always trying to expand their land for more planting. And so, lastly, the makers of America, the Iroquois. So the Iroquois League, which occupied what is now New York State, or known as the Iroquois Confederation, was a great power, and it was made up of 6 tribes that I will not try and pronounce because I will butcher it, and you don't need to know exactly the 6 tribes for a test or for the AP, but one of the tribes was the Mohawks, and they were like the middlemen for European traders. And so the Iroquois Confederation was sort of a big force that the British and the French and all the Europeans actually recognized. And they allied themselves with the British and the French, depending on which side they fought for. It varied. And so during the Revolutionary War, they were actually a force, and they backed the British mostly instead of the Patriots. And so after the Revolutionary War, the Iroquois were forced on the reservations, and that was sort of the end of them. And so I'll go over the timeline and some vocab in the final video. But for that, that's the end of the book. And so I'll see you in the next chapter.